Good afternoon and welcome to CSIS. Thank you for joining our panel on the era of purposeful genomic manipulation begins. Can DoD benefit? And this, of course, is based on a report that Carol Kuntz, one of our panelists and a CSIS fellow, did entitled Genomes, the era of purposeful manipulation begins. By a fluke, not through any planning, this follows by a day the release of an executive order from the president on exactly this topic. For that reason, you will be able to ask questions. There should be a button on the CSIS website that you can submit your questions through, and we'll do that about 20 minutes before the end of the program, which is scheduled to end at 4 o'clock. Let me introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to ask them each to make introductory remarks on this topic. Jim Brase is the Deputy Associate Director for Computation at Lawrence Livermore National Labs. All of us know that, of course. Alexander Titus is the Vice President of Strategy at Colossal Biosciences, a former Deputy Assistant Director for Biotechnology in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for R&E. And then Carol Kuntz, as I said, is a fellow here at CSIS, and also an adjunct professor at Georgetown and a professorial lecturer at George Washington University. So a great panel, very timely discussion. What we'll do is begin with some opening remarks, then we'll talk among ourselves, and then we'll see if there are any good questions from the audience. So with that, let me start by asking Jim if he would like to make some opening remarks. And if you could take about 5 minutes, that would be great.
Did you want to go to Carol first?
No, I have you on my,
okay.
They give me a script. And so if we deviate from the script, everything will go off the rails.
All right. I'm happy to. Thanks for the invitation to join. And as you said, I'm Jim Brase. I'm Deputy Associate Director for Computing at Livermore. And for the past 7 or 8 years, I've been focused on the intersection of high performance computing, machine learning, and a whole variety of applications in biology. Since Lawrence Livermore is one of the DOE national security labs, there's been a heavy focus in our program on biosecurity, biodefense, rapid response to bioemergencies of all sorts and things like that. The convergence of machine learning high performance simulation and the digitization of biotech really to provide large amounts of data really is transforming the capabilities in these areas for the future. Things like our understanding and ability to target specific complex genetic networks for therapeutics, for diagnostics is growing at an amazing rate. Our ability in the area that I've worked a lot in, using these large data sets with machine learning and simulation together to accelerate the development of new therapeutics, whether they're vaccines or whether they're antibody, proteins, small molecules, vaccines, is also transformative. But this work is really just beginning, and the principal fuel for these developments is really data. And this is true across the board with applications of AI in general, that where we see rapid progress in these areas, it's really because the data has become available to drive this. And it's important that the data be accessible, be usable, and that it can be used to grow the community around these. That's really where a lot of the amplification of capability comes from. So the curation and sustainment of large databases, one of the points that Carol made in her report, really is critical to the success of this overall endeavor. Large genomic databases with associated electronic health records and demographics really enable the creation and the understanding of subtle patterns in these genetic processes that allow us to develop new therapeutic targets, for example. Having molecular interaction databases, then how chemistry can interact with biology, and having that for millions to billions of molecules are critical to the development of the predictive models that allow us to do new types of molecular design in much faster than our serial experimental processes that we use today. This is really the combination of these capabilities, the development of new targets coming from genomic and patient databases, and the ability to optimize new molecules for interaction with those are really coming together to be the key to being able to do joint optimization of things like drug efficacy, safety and toxicology, and we're doing that now. We're actually in relatively limited ways now through partnerships that are being developed between the public sector and the private sector. We're showing that. The ATOM partnership that I run, the GUIDE partnership that the DoD has started with the national labs are developing this. We've just demonstrated re-engineering of a SARS-CoV-2 antibody that was basically made, its efficacy was reduced almost zero by the Omicron variant. We were able to re-engineer that in 2 weeks based on this computational design approach that was dependent on these kinds of models and the underlying data. And that's now in going into human trials at a pharma, at one of the major pharma companies. So our goal to bring these data sets together really is the driver for this technology. And as Carol talks extensively in the report, it's difficult. There are impediments at every step. They're both legal and privacy preservation, but also intellectual property, particularly in the molecular database side of this. And these all come together to make this a challenging area to work in and to grow. I think the approach of developing public-private partnerships like the ones I've been involved in is a very promising approach to this. We can bring public sector organizations like national labs together with pharma and university groups and bring these things together in a total organization then that has capabilities to handle data in trusted and secure ways, but also can then bring the technical expertise to take the best possible technical approaches at things like de-identification, but also ensuring access and getting getting components of this at least into the public sector so that we can grow the communities around these. And I think that's a worthy goal for the future and really worthy of spending our time and effort on. And I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. I think we'll come back to a number of those topics in our discussion. Let me now turn to Alex. Carol, you're going to get the last word in case you haven't figured it out. So Alex, please.
Yeah, thanks, Jim and Carol. It's great to be here. I'm certainly would echo basically everything that Jim said. I also come from a computational biology background, so Jim and I see eye to eye on an awful lot. In Carol's report, just the same thing. I'm currently the VP of Strategy at Colossal Biosciences, which is a really interesting application of what we can do with modern genome editing, because we're working to de-extinct the woolly mammoth by being able to do engineering and understand the information, the data we collect from ancient DNA, from frozen specimens of mammoths, and then how do we bring that to modern times. But before that, I was the assistant director for biotech at the Department of Defense, where I was brought in to launch modernization for the first time, Biotech Modernization specifically, and it's really about bringing a new paradigm to the department for how we approach technology development. You know, for thousands of years, humanity has had physical solutions to things, wheels, things like that. Then in the Industrial Revolution, we had chemical solutions to things, and we have new clothes, new products that really changed the way that the world worked. And now we have that third dimension which is the biological solutions of things. And the way, for anyone who's not kind of familiar with the synthetic biology world, is really what it is exquisite chemistry. So we're making small microbes and other organisms be able to produce new chemicals that we've never been able to do before. And so that fundamentally, that's biology and biotech is a data field that's locked in the physical format of living matter. And so when we figure out sequencing and other methods, what that information is, then we then turn that back into physical products through a number of different ways. But the really interesting part about biology as compared to, say, iPhone manufacturing or something, is that you don't walk around and pick up small transistors out of the forest and then put them into your iPhone, right? But that's how we do with a lot of the way we do manufacturing, or at least discovery of new genetic elements. I think there's a statistic that 10% of the microbes in every scoop of dirt we have never seen before. If you think about that from a genetic diversity standpoint, that's a heck of a lot of transistors in the forest that you could pick up and start to try to use. And so it's a massive data problem in a way that we don't have to engineer everything from scratch, which is good because we still have no idea how to engineer this from scratch. But we take that and put it into once we start to collate that information, and then we want to create really novel products, there's a whole paradigm of design for manufacturing in the physical world. That's why we can do high throughput production of microelectronics and things like that. But biology still doesn't have that unifying set of information that gives us those design parameters that we can use. And that's where a lot of these databases that Jim mentioned and that Carol really highlights in the report come into play. And just for one brief example to really contextualize why this data is so interesting, there's a great Atlantic article about a young woman in the UK who was dying of an incurable infection. Doctors couldn't figure out how to cure this infection, and so they contacted a faculty member in Pennsylvania, I think at the University of Pittsburgh, who runs a large database of collecting phage genomes from around the world. And phages are viruses that specifically infect bacteria. And so for decades, this professor had been encouraging people around the world to collect scoops of dirt, identify those phages, sequence them, and then deposit them in this database. And once they did the data mining of this database, they actually found something that was likely to be effective at fighting this infection. They engineered a new version of that, just like Jim said about kind of repurposing something. And they cured this infection that they couldn't otherwise cure. But the reason this is really important is because the piece of data found in the database at the University of Pittsburgh was collected by a high school student on the bottom of a rotting eggplant in South Africa. And for a high school project, they collected, sequenced, and deposited. And then we had this kind of medical marvel that because of that transfer of information and that collection of data that you don't necessarily know you're going to need until you need it. And Carol touches on this, but that's one of the challenges of the department, is that data is not necessarily a capability. So there's not good mechanisms to fund and sustain. But in the world of AI and biotech and many other fields, data now is the new paradigm that we really have to think about. And so there's a big conversation that the department needs to think about, all of the departments, not just DoD, about how do you take, operationalize, and incentivize, like the Atom Partnership, private sector members to really take advantage of that. So I'll leave it at that. There's lots to dig into, but suffice it to say, I agree with just about everything Jim and Carol say.
Good. That usually it's better if you have a panel that disagrees with each other, but in this case, we have so much ground to cover that it's probably a good thing. Carol, you do get the last words. If you can tell us about the report, tell us a little bit more about what you're thinking.
Thank you. This is actually a wonderful way to start it because, Jim and Alexander, as they've demonstrated, are technical experts. And I joined CSIS, as you know, after 30 years of service in DoD. So I really came at this issue with the concern, which many share, that DoD needs to do a better job of incorporating cutting edge technology. And both Alexander and Jim and other technical experts made me aware of the extraordinary advances in the biotechnologies and the many ways that DoD could be benefiting from it, but really was not because of what I believe is a problem it's having incorporating cutting edge technology. The study argues that to be able to better incorporate these extraordinary technologies that Jim and Alexander have given us a little bit of an overview of, DoD needs to make structural changes. it needs to build deeper, more direct links between the military and this robust academic and commercial research sector that's making these incredible advances. Because it's in this technology it's in this community that these technologies are advancing, and they're advancing very, very rapidly. And I'm concerned fundamentally as a DoD policy person that the DoD is lagging, and absent these structural changes, we won't be able to catch up. The report argues that DoD needs to create career paths for uniformed practitioners of new technologies. Well, we have wonderful civilian experts. Both Jim and Alexander have supported military efforts. We also need to supplement their work by having senior military officers who are up to date on these technologies so they can embed them in operational concepts and programs and budgets so that Alexander and Jim don't have to spend as much time. There's a little bit of a challenge bringing people up to date on some of these cutting edge technologies. And if we could build greater expertise in the uniformed services, I think that would really facilitate the work. I also think DoD needs to rely more directly on this external commercial and academic sector. That's really where these technical advances are occurring, and they're happening so quickly. We need to be connected there. And given that DoD should be relying on the domestic sector, it has the greatest of interest in assuring the health of that domestic sector. Along with them, there's not only national security benefits, but there's strategic benefits in terms of economic growth for the United States, technological leadership for the United States, and some of these medical benefits that Jim particularly talked about. And so I want to turn now to three specific reforms that need to be made to the domestic academic and commercial biotech sector to make sure it can flourish. Before I do that, though, let me just go back for those of us who are not PhDs in computational biology and just say in terms I at least can understand some of these extraordinary things they've been talking about. This new ability to purposefully manipulate genomes grows out of the convergence, as I understand it, and I defer to my erudite doctors, that it's really the convergence of three extraordinary technologies. We have the ability now to sequence the base pairs in a genome or in DNA, which everybody remembers from high school biology is the blueprint for all living organisms. Then the second technical advantage is CRISPR-Cas. That's about 5 years old. Folks have probably seen it in the newspaper, but it enables very precise edits to the genome. And the third, and really the one that was a shock to me until people like Alexander and Jim made me aware of it, is the important role that machine learning algorithm plays in this area, and frankly, as in so many others. But what the machine learning algorithms enable is us to understand which genes should be edited to create an organism with a particular desired trait. And it's just as a tourist in this area, unlike my other panel members, it's just extraordinary the opportunities for DoD and the United States in general to use these technologies. And let me give you some examples. They can create molecules by using these technologies that fluoresce in the presence of effluents from landmines, which obviously is the kind of thing DoD is very interested in. Other examples are things like, could they build us something that would fluoresce in the presence of fissile material, a classic DoD core interest? Could they build something that would fluoresce in the presence of the precursors for improvised explosive devices? These are the kinds of things that could be critical for DoD and which we're really not moving on, even though they're technically possible. And I also think there's great promise in tailored therapeutics and legitimate gene editing that could cure disease. So if DoD is going to rely more directly on the US sector, there are ways in which I think while we lead in discovery, we are not leading in sustained innovation and in production, although yesterday's EO, I think, is going to make important progress in both of those areas. So let me talk about the three recommendations that I particularly focus on in the report that I think are important for making the sector healthy, so DoD can benefit from this sector and many other aspects of society as well. First, I think we need to build a technical sector in the United States for legitimate human genome editing. I think that's quite important. It holds extraordinary promise to cure disease. Such legitimate gene editing is not currently allowed in the United States. And I think we need to be participating in that sector so that we can build norms to facilitate legitimate efforts and to discourage illegitimate ones. Second, it's been a lot of work by folks like Jim and Alexander with their technical backgrounds, but I've come to understand why large, well-curated databases are a strategic priority in this era of artificial intelligence. I don't believe that the United States government has quite reoriented its efforts to be consistent with that. As you talk with bench researchers, and I've wandered around some of the labs and talked to them, it's almost impossible for them to get the data sets that they need to conduct studies that I think are of the greatest interest to the Secretary of Defense or to other top officials. And so we're just making it impossible for our researchers to use this incredible tool for innovation and progress. So we really do need to, and echoing what Jim said, we need to change laws, regulations, and norms to facilitate the creation of databases. We probably need some new organizational structures that have nonprofits that can use these databases for public purposes. So secondly, we really need to recognize the importance of these databases and ease their creation and use in the United States. And third, as we've seen in some other areas, and frankly, as the work yesterday, that the EO yesterday facilitates, we need to make sure we've got production capabilities in the United States. To create these molecules, they're often called biofoundries. We need to make sure that we've got a robust domestic sector of this production capability for these engineered molecules. We've got efficient processes to evaluate their safety, create their needed databases, and have the trained staff. So as I look at this from a national security perspective, it's critical that DoD incorporate this among many emerging technologies. It can do that most effectively by having a greater expertise in uniformed military so that they can work more effectively with civilian experts like Jim and Alexander. And then we need to make sure that the health of our domestic sector, and I've outlined 3 recommendations to improve that health. As I look at these trajectories currently, I am very troubled that they're leading toward a dominance on the part of China in terms of sustained innovation and production in these areas. I do think these trajectories can be reversed to the types of policies outlined here and by other analysts, and that this new technology could greatly benefit DoD, could greatly benefit the U.S. strategically in economic, medical, and technological terms. But given the extraordinary promise of these technologies, I do worry as a policy analyst, not a technologist, that failing to reverse these trajectories could lead to a variety of problems for the United States in economic terms and medical terms and technological terms, and frankly, in terms of deterrence and ultimately war.
Great. I'm going to pick up 4 topics and we'll see if we have time to cover them all. But we mentioned data and data policies, use of compute, machine learning, AI, tech development, and then the executive order. But I'm going to start with a couple of you said, we need a new approach to tech development. What would that look like? And Jim, why don't we start with you? I mean, what would that look like, given how different the landscape is from, say, 30 years ago?
Yeah. I think I'd start out by picking up on one theme that Carol had, which is, the word from the point of view of a researcher in government. Now, the world looks very different today than it did when I started my career, say, quite a few years ago. Where and working at Livermore this whole time, we were doing nuclear security. We basically brought a bunch of smart people into 1 square mile and locked the gate. and brought in big computers and big experimental things and so on. And the technology was developed in the government and then flowed out from there. The situation, particularly in areas like biology, AI, and computing in general, and so on, that are now critical, is completely the opposite of that. So we have important priorities in the government for the use of these technologies, but 90+% of the advances in this are coming from the outside. So we need to change our thinking so that we can actually be working with the private sector and with leading university programs to bring that in within the government, providing the unique resources and tools and capabilities where we have good things here as well. And we can be much better together doing all this. So the development of new approaches to public-private partnerships, the ability to use those partnerships then to feed back both to the private sector and to the public sector priorities is really important. And I think that's a very different way for the government to be looking at advancing science and technology than we have in the past. And so I think that's where you have to start, is thinking about how do I come up with constructs that support and advance that and provide the needed incentives for both sides of that to advance it and so on. So I think that's a really important area of figuring out how we can work together to do this.
Great. Alex, you've been on both sides of the street. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of different challenges. One, so as Jim said, the government has plenty of the high value needs that they care about. Those aren't always communicated well to the developers who aren't the people, the systems integrators who speak government, right? The synthetic biology and modern biotech is largely in small business and startups. There's big businesses in this as well, but the kind of bulk of innovation right now is in those smaller businesses who aren't steeped in governmentese, don't understand the contracting mechanisms, don't even know who to ask, who the big questions are. And so, like when I was in government, people would come to me and say, we can make anything you want, just tell me what you want. And on my side, I wouldn't necessarily know what they did. So I'd say, well, tell me what you do. And they say, well, we make anything you want. And so there's a communication barrier there that makes it hard to communicate or to share those priorities. And so I think from the government side, being able to share those priorities first starts with understanding what the technology can do. And the kind of two big areas that I would split biology into, because biology and biotech is like saying electrical engineering or physics. It's like, well, you can do a lot with those. You can make pacemakers or pipe bombs with electrical engineering. It depends on how you apply it, right? And so in biology, the kind of two big buckets I look at is when the product is biological, so mRNA-based vaccines or some kind of medical countermeasure or something like that. But then biology is now producing inherently not biology products. It's another type of chemical manufacturing. And so when you think of it in the paradigm of chemical manufacturing as you would many of the materials that we need, okay, it's a materials science problem. Now we can put it in the context of what the DoD has had for a long time. Let me define the material properties I want and then communicate those to the biologists and say, can you make something that's even better than the material properties I'm asking for? And so that is how we're really going to bridge the gap in this tech development. But we got to kind of meet in the middle when that communication.
Carol, you kind of already touched on what some changes would be. You can go back to them if you want, but why don't you also, and I know you've looked at it, tell us what China does differently, and then I'll ask Alex and Jim if they have views. So you said you were worried about China, and we know that the Chinese have done some interesting things. What do they do differently than we do?
Well, one of the things they do, Alexander noted that most biotech advances are made in the context of startups. The common model is that pharmaceuticals buy a successful startup. That's their principal technique for getting innovation into a big company. And the U.S. government is, and particularly DoD, is very poor at working with this community of small startups. I don't know if it's apocryphal, but I was told that a biotech startup would be bankrupt before it would receive a penny from a DoD contract let on the standard timeline, i.e. that you wouldn't get your first penny from a DoD contract until, I think, 6 months. And by that time, most biotech startups evidently are either bankrupt or their founders are multimillionaires. So it's, under that vignette, it's absolutely impossible for DoD using its standard contracting measures to interact with this community. So given all that the bio startups have to offer for DoD, and we've given you several examples, the fact that using standard contracting procedures is utterly incompatible with this entire economic sector of startups, is kind of crazy in this day and age. China, in contrast, is much more, its actors can participate as members of this international scientific community. It has venture capital companies that can participate in U.S. startups. It has academics who can participate, Chinese academics who can participate. But when they go back to China, they're often, behave in a more integrated way to advance national objectives. One thing I wanted to pick up on, Alexander made the point of the difficulty of really understanding what military needs are. And I think that's a real issue. And that's one of the reasons why I am urging, along with many other observers, that DoD create these career paths for practitioners of these technologies. We have a situation where individuals at the 05 or 06 level, which is the lieutenant colonel or colonel level in the Air Force and the Army, are at about the 20-year mark in their careers, are setting requirements for a lot of these programs. For example, in the biodefense community, they're setting the requirements for the technical characteristics of vaccines. These folks are wonderful officers. Their hearts are in the right place. They're very intelligent. They're very responsible, but they haven't had biology since high school. And as somebody who hasn't had biology since high school and has had to try to learn and understand these issues, it ain't easy. And so poor Alexander is trying to say, no, everybody's got DNA and RNA and it's really different from 20 years ago. And I think to be able to really benefit from the insights that people like, Alexander, who serve in OSD R&E, or Jim Brase, who serves at a national lab, we need more technically able military officers, particularly when you think about developing things like operational concepts, which can make all the difference in a war-winning application of technology, or when we think about refining and optimizing program and budgets, where DoD, bless its heart, really falls down at incorporating emerging technologies.
This is, by the way, a consistent theme in program events, because we've had previous events with DIU and other defense innovators, all of whom are underfunded and oppressed by acquisition regulations. So before we talk about that, let me say, Jim or Alexander, do you see anything in China that you would want? I mean, when you have China envy when it comes to this? And there are some things, not having to go to Congress every 2 years, that's a plus, or every year is a plus, but anything else?
I would say for me, it's their approach to data. China knows that data now might not be clear what it's used for, but it will be useful someday. And so they're going to collect it and keep it indefinitely. And that's an approach that we don't take. And to Carol's report very clearly says we should think about it in a more refined way. But yeah, if I could be the Hoover vacuum of data, that would be my magic wand wish.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I think that's the area where I see that what's happening in China really is outpacing what we're doing here. As I said, data really is the fuel for this revolution, and you do need it in sufficient quantities, and you need to sustain the efforts over time. I think that's really important, and that's something we're really bad at. We actually can get some money sometimes to build a database and so on, but then trying to get funding available to sustain that, to keep going with that over the time that's necessary is very, very difficult. So yeah, I think in having the policies and procedures in place, they would certainly be different here than in China. But I think that with proper application of sort of a systems approach to handling this data, we could do this in a way that's consistent with what we value in this country. And so I think we're not. I think that the perception of risk with this is so high in both the government and the private sector that no one wants to touch it.
I would say there's probably lots of people listening saying, well, I don't do biology, and we also need that. The future of any technology is data-driven. So this is not a unique to biology.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yep.
That's why fundamental reshifting of a paradigm of how we approach data will benefit everything we do going forward.
This is another topic that comes up over and over again. Is what kind of data are we talking about? I mean, there was hearings today in the Congress on TikTok and Twitter, and people are concerned about China collecting biometric data off social media. Is that the kind of data we're talking about? Is it something more specific? Just put this in context for us.
I do think that's a great question, because data in the royal we is hard to define in the abstract. So I'll give a very specific one set of examples. So the data that I referenced from the phage genome that was collected on an eggplant in South Africa. So there are microbes and microorganisms all around the world that we collect and that we sequence, and that we understand what their genomes are, and we start to figure out what different parts of those genomes do. So just from a microbial and microorganism approach, that is not human biometric data. That is not PII. That is not HIPAA concerns, but it is the proverbial collecting of the transistors in the forest, where you can then build the microelectronics, the modern biology from it. And so even things like that, where the latest E. coli strain doesn't need its own personal privacy protections, but we could still use that as a chassis for future development. We could learn something from something we've never seen before. That 10% of every scoop of dirt we've never seen before from a microorganism standpoint. So that's one of many examples, but that alone unlocks a lot of what modern synthetic biology and modern biotech is approaching.
Jim, when you think of data, what do you think of?
Well, I think of sort of two directions that I think of in the programs that I'm doing. One is the large collections of human genomic data with associated electronic health records and demographics. Those are clearly very sensitive data and have to be treated that way, but they're also hugely enabling for understanding the relationships between genome, what we call the exposome, the things that people have been exposed to throughout their lives, and then then their responses to that. And there are projects that are ongoing, like VA's Million Veterans Project for collecting those and associating them with electronic health records, which are great projects. But the pace with which we can go at that is just extremely slow compared to other countries doing this, and not just the Chinese. But then the other direction I think about are these more chemical biology data sets that we talk about. These are really, and with these, the restrictions really tend to be intellectual property. They're generally collected by companies, either small startups collect lots of data like this, or large pharmas. And that data is hugely valuable for training the models for then what does a particular molecule do to that biology? And so those are the two types of data sets. The data on the chemical biology side can be very large in a different way than the genomics data is. We can look at potentially trillions of molecules and understand and measure at some level their interactions with things like a whole variety of human proteins. That's what the data sets look like, is that kind of thing.
Right.
I would also say that historically, the perspective on biology from the government has been biodefense or healthcare. To what Jim's saying, though, and what I was mentioning, we're in this new paradigm where non-health is a big imperative of biology. And so if we make the mistake of having a one-size-fits-all data approach, it will go to it's basically classification, right? You go to the most classified level, you go to the most protected level to make sure that you're not exposing that. But if we take a separate and deliberate approach to these new subcategories, we can unlock a lot. So we don't want to run the risk of overprotecting data that certainly doesn't need to be.
And I was going to tell the audience that now's a good time if you have questions. But before I could say that, we've already gotten one. Alexander, you touched on what I was going to make my next question. Jim, when you said data is the principal fuel for this, I actually wrote it down and thought, and Carol touches on this a lot in the report. What would a good data structure look like? What would a good set of data policies look like? Because we have a lot of data policies in the US. Many of them come from the last century, which is a hint. What would a new revised version look like? I don't know who wants to start first. Carol, Jim.
Well, I'll defer to Jim, but one of the things that struck me when looking at this is this is an area where you really want the government to catalyze the ability to collect the data, but not execute that ability. It really can't be a top-down. It's really going to be more of a bottom-up, driven by the questions of researchers. Would that be the approach you would envision, Jim?
Yeah. What the policy set that would be most effective around this really depends on what the data is and what the question you're trying to address is. I think it's I define these sort of two different directions of data sets. And I think the policies and processes around them are quite different. I think from my point of view, what we need to do on the chemical biology data side is create sufficient incentives for companies that are working in developing those kinds of both the measurement technology and then the actual data sets that come out of it to share. I think those data are valuable to them. They're often the sort of the lifeblood of their company. But I think there can be incentive structures put together that can make it worthwhile to share in some cases for that data, and we need to explore those kinds of approaches from that side. I think on the human genomes plus EHR plus demographics, there I think the real issue is that we do need to provide a systems approach to protection of that data that allows us to maintain privacy and reduce the risks of sharing to a sufficiently low level that they're manageable, or where the benefits that can come out of those, which are great, override the remaining risk. I don't think we can take the risk to zero on making that data available, but we can through combinations of access controls. We have organizations that know how to protect data very well, but by combinations of sort of a systems approach to combining access controls with modern, very systematic de-identification approaches, I think those risks can be controlled and demagnified at least to a reasonable degree. But we need an active program looking at that. And I should say one important thing in that area is we need to be able to quantify it. because we don't have capabilities really to measure and quantify the risk associated with data releases like this. And therefore we can't really compare to the benefits in any systematic way. So it's really hard to have a cost benefit or discussion about that, because we don't really, it's all driven by very qualitative stories generally. And so we can't do a systematic comparison. So it's hard to have the full discussion that you want.
It's a whole separate discussion to talk about innovation in a risk-averse society.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah.
We'll put that one aside. Alexander, if you had a perfect data policy or a better data policy, what would it look like?
So if I think about, so I've talked a lot about the synthetic biology world. Let's talk a brief about the healthcare side. I think that we have ordered leaps and bounds progress in privacy preserving types of computing technique. So in many different classes, homomorphic encryption, differential privacy, there's plenty of things that sound like a Halloween costume kind of thing. but the policies that were put in place, decades ago, were because the algorithms that at that time required you to look at all of it in one place and actually look at it in some capacity. Versus now, I mean, the way that Apple and Google and Microsoft do all of their analysis of all of the data that comes off of the websites and their phones and all that kind of stuff is all de-identified, all with the most cutting edge types of technology for de-identification while still doing analysis, distributed, etc. We have made amazing strides. So we could, at this point, there is a version of the world, given the right policies, where you could analyze data across 100 hospitals around the US from different companies, all from different healthcare systems, without exposing any of that information to anyone other than saying, we know that 10,000 patients with this disease type, we have no idea who these patients are, but they have this disease, that's their phenotype. And we know they also have this kind of genetic marker. So now we can go try to work with the private sector to develop a drug and try to build a therapeutic. But our data policies are now hard lined at, because of the risk aversion, which I don't disagree with, but I think that there's a modernization of those policies that allow for this kind of privacy preserving, distributed kind of approach.
Yeah.
Just to give everyone a heads up, we will come back to the executive order. But one of the questions we got from the audience was, how do international norms on heritable genome editing play with the US adoption of these emerging technologies? I thought that was a good question. I don't know who wants to go first, Carol. So international norms on.
No, I'm happy to. I do just want to underscore how important I think the two recent interventions were by Jim and Alexander. I think this issue of modernizing our data policy is critical from the point of view of U.S. strategic interest and our competitiveness, both in national security and economic and technological terms. And I think it's eminently tractable. I mean, it would take a lot of work. It would be very complicated. But I really, the more I look at this, the more I think it is doable and should be a prime focus of an executive branch initiative with appropriate congressional support. So anyway, you
wouldn't need legislation to do this.
Well, with congressional support was my last clause.
Okay.
So, and I do think you would, as we looked at particular, but the thing is you'd have to, but I think it's critically important. I think it is tractable, although complicated. On the issue of international norms and legitimate human genome editing, I think it's essential that the United States play a leading role to build international norms, encouraging legitimate human genome editing and discouraging illegitimate human genome editing. I think that would have benefits, particularly in the labs most likely to make technical mistakes. So I think the U.S. should play a leading role. There are technical groups looking at this issue of what would be legitimate uses of this technology, but there's not really a diplomatic effort to build these norms. And I think that would be an appropriate role for the United States to play. Even as the U.S. sought to build those international norms, I think it is essential that the U.S. pursue a research context for legitimate human genome editing, which at present is not permitted in the United States. And so I think that also is worrisome. It's obviously there's some technical issues about CRISPR to be worked out first, and we should certainly do that. But I think once those things are worked out, it is very important that the United States realign the legal and regulatory issues which do not allow this type of research to go forward in the context of our main research venues.
Jim, Alexander, international norms on heritable genome editing. Any comments? No? Then we'll go to the $1 million question of the day. So what do you think of the show? Jim, we'll start with you. And
I'm delighted to see it. A number of the programs that we've developed in these partnerships across the Department of Energy, the DoD now, and then the private sector, NIH, started out in the first cancer moonshot from then Vice President Biden in 2015, 2016. So I'm delighted to see the focus come back to this, because I think, the world has changed a lot since then, even over the last 5, 6, or 7 years. And I think if anything, the potential is greater and better understood than it was then. And I think some of the issues we need to address on databases, on having more effective public-private partnership to execute these things are in a better place now than they were then. So I'm delighted.
Great. That's easy to summarize. Alexander.
Yeah, I know many of the wonderful people behind the conversation, behind the, each door that was having those discussions. And the beautiful thing about the EO is it reflects 99% of the conversations I've had across the community around what really needs to be tackled. Many people will say, yeah, there's a lot more to be done. And that's always the case, but it represents a collective vision for how to take a step forward in a way that I haven't been as intimately involved in another field that was represented by an EO, but in this one, the way that it came together and President Biden's vision on that is impressive. And I think that the biotech community and the scientific community and both government, private sector, industry, academia would largely agree with that.
Great. Carol, your views?
I agree. I'm delighted. I think it represents meaningful progress. I think there's more that should be done. And I do remain concerned, that DoD is still, DoD is still poorly positioned to adequately benefit from these important advances.
And that's a good lead into the next question from the audience, which might be the last one we have time for. We'll see. But it's one of those favorite Washington topics. And I thought of myself when I was reading the EO. Considering that there are multiple dimensions, such as health versus non-health, U.S. government funded versus not USG funded, which agency, officer, or partnership should primarily be in charge of access to genomic data? And this question came, by the way, from the National Human Genome Research Institute. So so that tells you who you should say, I guess. But what do you think? I mean, this is always a tough one in DC. Who should be in charge of this?
Well, I'm not sure that there should be a single one. So, for example, USDA should be in charge of agriculture and livestock kind of data. So every plant in America, and as many as we can find, having those genomes available so we could understand how to prevent disease for crops and things like that. That's clearly a USDA thing. And you could have the same examples for many of the other agencies. The agencies that have much kind of broader cross-cutting missions, like the Department of Defense, or while the Department of Energy has a very clear mission, well, they all do, but there's so many different ways you tackle energy and kind of the future of sustainable energy. That is a bit different, and it'll be a bit larger. Same with the Department of Defense. But if we have these in place, right, the defense of our food supply or our future of sustainable energy production, maybe we'll do a new wave of biofuels, produced oils, whatever it happens to be. I think that there is justification for a massive approach to data from every agency.
Yeah. I would, encourage folks to consider the creation of nonprofits. You could, for example, have perhaps a consortium of research universities that could manage this on behalf of multiple users, including government users. I'm very struck by the UK Biobank as a possible model, which seems to work extremely well. As much as I love government and enjoyed my career in government, I'm not sure it's always ideally suited to managing, data of this kind of sensitivity and staying up to date technically. So I would nominate a kind of nonprofit organization that was constituted with some appropriate members, and it would support both government and non-government and be consistent with broader values.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I think particularly when we're bringing together both public data sources and private data sources, having an independent organization which is managing that, and then the government role really is to set the uniform and coherent policies that need to be followed in how you authorize use of that, how you protect it, and so on.
Right.
One of the things I'm a big fan of is CRISPR. It's just really cool. But do you think people realize that? And if they realize it, how are they going to react? When I talk to people and describe a little bit, very often their first reaction is, we need to put on the brakes. And I kind of feel the other way, but I don't know what you're thinking. Just sort of a closing thought for all three of you is, how do we get public support for the tremendous potential of these new biotechnologies? What would you do? And
I think we need to do a better job of not just talking about, for example, around things around human genome editing, but talking about, I think Titus made a couple references to this, but the use in, for example, well, we have a project we're doing right now in engineering bacteria to create a protein which will grab rare earth elements out of waste streams. And this is a absolutely innovative approach, much higher efficiency than the standard industrial approaches to do this, and very green. And things like that can just revolutionize how we handle the new technologies that are needed for environmental cleanup, for climate change response, things like that. So there's a whole variety of areas that I think people are pretty much unaware of, where this is actually moving forward very rapidly. And I think broader understanding of some of those areas would be beneficial.
Alexander, what do you look at when you were at Colossal? I mean, what's your elevator speech on this?
So the great thing about, and one of the things that drew me to Colossal, is that it is describing an outcome that people who are not deep in the weeds of biology understand, right? Just like the moonshot was not about Tang and space blankets, yet we have them, right? But going to the moon was a vision. So at Colossal, the de-extinction of a woolly mammoth, whether or not you agree with that, you know what a woolly mammoth is. You can think about touching its fur, listening to it trumpet, seeing it in the wild, whatever it happens to be. And nothing about that says, well, let's get into the weeds about CRISPR-Cas9 and Jennifer Doudna's 2018 Nobel Prize. right? Or 2020 Nobel Prize. So we don't have to go into the depths when we talk about the kind of impact that you can feel from some of these products. And so that's what I try to lead with as much as possible. Like when I was at DoD trying to get support for this, I talked about growable runways and things like this rather than the microbes that did it. And so in my perfect world, we would very quickly stop talking about biology entirely and say, isn't this a wonderful product? And then that's the end of the story. And we happen to produce it the most efficient, environmentally friendly, green, and cost-effective way possible. Sometimes it's biology, sometimes it's something else. But that is a great outcome that I really want us to rush towards.
Great. Carol, we're over time, but you still got the last word.
I really agree with this. I think it's incumbent on, those of us who find this technology stuff fascinating, however sophisticated our technical understanding, is to do a better job of explaining its many benefits. I was just astonished. This rare earth example is very powerful. The growable runways is very powerful. And I think we need to do a better job of explaining the benefits, and frankly, within the government, highlighting the risk of failing to recognize how important fixing some of these database problems, for example, will prove as we look at this new strategic era.
Great. Well, Carol, your report is on our website. The full bios of all three panelists are on our website. Jim Brase, Alexander Titus, Carol Kuntz, thank you. And thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us. Have a good day.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.